I'm sure you know them by heart, so we can recite them together. I'm going to read the translation afterwards. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم. ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون والذين يؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون. In the name of God, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful, all praise belongs to God, the Lord of all realms, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful, Master of the day of retribution. We worship you alone and we turn to you for help. Guide us in the straight path, the path of those whom you have blessed, not those who have incurred your wrath, and not those who are astray. In the name of God, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful. Alif Lam Mim. This is the book in which there is no doubt, a guidance to the God-weary. Those who believe in the unseen, those who believe in the unseen and establish the prayer and pay charity of what we have provided for them, and those who believe in what has been sent down to you, O Muhammad, and what was sent down before you, and are certain of the hereafter. Those are upon guidance from their Lord, and it is they who are the felicitous. So, that was the first 12 verses of the Holy Quran from chapters 1 and 2. I want to welcome you all to the exciting event we have today. And I want to congratulate you for the 3rd anniversary of Lady Fatima al-Zahra, the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The title of today's workshop is Women in the Quran in the Light of the Conflict with Modernity. And our keynote speaker is Ms. Amina Inloes, joining us from London, UK, who actually teaches about Islam and modernity. So we're really fortunate to have someone from the field who works academically on this topic delivering this speech for us. So I want to thank her for accepting our invitation, despite her jet lag and despite the day-long symposium at Mekon. We just ended like 1 hour ago. The event has been jointly organized by 4 groups and communities in the Montreal area, which is a small step toward more collaboration, more coordination between the Muslim community in the Montreal area. So I want to extend my thanks to all of the brothers and sisters who helped, who did all they could, sincerely, diligently, without any reservation, without any hesitation, to bring about this event. Since some of you may not be familiar with the 4 organizations, I'm going to read a small description of each based on the information on their websites and what they have provided. So, we'll go in alphabetical order. One of the organizers is the Path of Light, which was formed in early 2006 in Montreal by a small group of Canadian Muslims. The formation of this organization was in response to a perceived need for quality events and activities in English and French that was not being satisfied sufficiently by existing Muslim centers in Montreal. The group was organized around one major goal: to develop and carry out activities and programs in English and French that are oriented toward 3 target audiences in mind: Canadian Muslim converts, Muslim youth, and non-Muslims in the Montreal community interested in learning about Islam and Muslims. Another organizer of today's event is TMA, or the Tagalog Muslim Association, which is a Concordia University student group that encourages active dialogue and debate on a variety of topics. It seeks to promote the exchange of ideas at Concordia University and is committed to addressing modern issues in the light of Islamic thought. Next is the Tawhid Society of Montreal, also known as Kanun Tawhid, which was formed in winter 2012 by a group of active Iranian students. The main goal of the society is to create a unified community of university students in Montreal who could join forces to promote the Shiite identity, while respecting each other's differences. The board of directors of Tawhid is elected on a democratic basis. And the fourth organizer is the UNM, or the United Muslims of Montreal, which was officially launched in November 2011, based on their in-depth understanding of the vacuum which exists in most of the centers in terms of English lectures. The objectives of UNM can be divided into two interrelated areas. One, to organize events which host English speakers and scholars, and two, to promote inter-community dialogue and activities. So it's certainly a blessing to see the communities coming together and collaborating to each other, and hopefully we're going to see more of this in the near future. Now, after Ms. Inloes' speech, we're going to have a Q&A session, and we do encourage all of you to bring up any questions that might arise for you. Gender issues could be controversial and may result in some heated discussions. All of that is welcome. So the goal of such a workshop is to open a dialogue and to extend the conversation, but by no means do we aim to reach a conclusion. Some of the topics that come up in such discussions have been around for centuries. So expecting to reach a unanimous conclusion in one session could result in disillusionment. Another point, only as a reminder in such discussions, is that what takes precedence to the content of our arguments and comments is how we form and present them in terms of methodology and language. Our first and foremost concern should be to keep our conversations rational, respectful, and constructive. Now, I also want to provide a brief introduction of our speaker, Ms. Inloes, just in case you haven't heard of her, although she's on YouTube, and she's quite famous. But Ms. Amina Inloes was born in Southern California in the United States. She became Muslim when she was 14. She holds an MA in Islamic Studies and an MA in teaching with an emphasis on math and mathematics. She's completing a PhD in Islamic Studies at Exeter University about the portrayal of pre-Islamic women in Shia Hadith. She worked for the Islamic College in London and instructs at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. She lectures on Islam worldwide and is a frequent guest on several Islamic satellite channels, including Ahmed Bek TV. One of her main interests is applying classical Islamic thought to the contemporary era. She currently lives in the United Kingdom. So let us welcome Ms. Inloes and open our hearts to the light of knowledge and sending peace upon Prophet Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. It's nice to see everyone here. Of course, I'd like to thank all of the many groups for their invitation. And I'm very fortunate that I'm sitting at this big table because, as Brother Ahmed was saying, both the issues of Islam and modernity, as well as Islam and gender, especially with regards to the discussion of women, are very controversial, very politicized, very sensitive issues that people often have very strong feelings about. So I'm going to be hiding under this table probably by the end of the session. Nevertheless, I do hope it is an interactive forum. I'm not going to take up the whole time with speaking, only a short portion of time. And so it will be good to hear everyone's views because both modernity as well as gender issues are something we all have expertise in by virtue of the fact that we are human beings and we deal with these subjects on a daily basis, no matter what background we hail from or what gender we happen to be. Also, I want to point out what Brother Ahmed very aptly said, that there are, in my view at least, there are a lot of open questions with regards to Islam and gender. Now I'm not trying to imply that there are no answers. As a practicing Muslim, and this is a faith-based speech, if you can't tell I'm a Muslim, and I am speaking from a perspective of faith. As a Muslim, I would believe that there is one truth, that Allah or God, He has the one truth. But we may disagree in how we understand it. And I think in the modern era, definitely the polarization of views about what the ideals are for women, or for that matter for men in Islam, has become very apparent. It's not like these are all modern issues. They have been around for centuries, but they're especially sort of debated in the modern era. And so, while I do believe there are answers, and I have my own humble views on what some of the answers are, I do acknowledge that many of these things are debated among all people and they don't agree on the answers. But in any case, I think if we can just bring up the questions, that's good. One of the things I've had to do in my life is teach a class on Islam and gender, which is generally something that women in Islamic studies always have to do. They say because you're female, you teach Islam and gender. But basically, I just ended up framing the whole class in terms of what are the contemporary questions about Islam and gender, and just looking at the different sides of those questions. Because there's obviously 1.4 billion or so Muslims and a lot of voices out there in the dialogue. Okay, so with these really big subjects that have been given to me today, I first want to start with modernity in general, Islam and modernity. What do we mean by modernity? Probably all of you would mean something else. I'm not going to be discussing modernity in terms of science and technology and progress, although sometimes when we colloquially say what's modern, we think of these mobile phones and video camera and whatever else it happens to be. I'm not going to use this definition for two reasons. One is, quite frankly, technology is not something modern. We've had it since the cave ages. People have had progress in technology and so forth. And now, of course, the belief that technology is the solution to all human ills and we'll find salvation through technology and happiness, this is a very modern view, which, of course, I mean, not necessarily of course, but which I think is, there is some tension between that view and Islam, or for that matter, many of the other world religions. And of course, I have some very strong feelings about how technology is used, even with regards to women. I'm sure we're all aware there are materials available on the internet which tremendously objectify and degrade women. I'm not going to describe what those materials are, but we probably know what I'm talking about. But that's not a problem with the technology, that's just an issue with the usage of technology. But first of all, technology is not new. It's not inherently bad or good. But also, as most of you are undoubtedly aware, Islamic civilization did bring on an era of scientific exploration and development of technologies, and so this is something which is very intrinsic in the Islamic tradition. Intellectual inquiry is seen as being in harmony with the faith. Faith and science are supposed to go together to help us understand God and His creation better. So I'm not going to be dealing with the science part of modernity. I'm going to be dealing with more of the philosophical framework of modernity. And that is what happened basically after the Enlightenment in Europe, whereby people defined the modern era as the era in which there was a break between traditional religious authority, or break from traditional religious authority. So in the previous time periods, the church, for example, had a lot of authority over people, Christian people at any rate, in Europe. And then after that, secularism eventually developed, and basically authority shifted from the divine to the human. So religion was not really a public matter, as we know. It became a matter of personal belief, and other forms of self-identification became more common. Instead of defining yourself in terms of a religious community, you might define yourself as a member of a nation state, for example, which is basically how we are nowadays. I'm sure if most people ask you to say something about yourself, one of the first things you'll say is I'm Canadian or American or whatever. So there's a shift basically from the divine to the human in terms of sort of the focus, and especially the focus in public society. And I'm generalizing, by the way. I'm not saying every modern philosopher has felt like that, but it's basically the trend of things, which we definitely see today. And also a sense that human beings define their own destiny. So for example, to pick one of these very controversial issues, if we want to talk about human rights, someone who's looking from a faith-based perspective and who's an adherent to a revealed religion would say it is the role of Allah, or it is the role of God, to define what are the human rights. So you would look at the revelation and say what human rights are listed in this revelation. Now you might disagree about how you interpret the revelation, but the point is your focus is on what is revealed. Whereas in the sort of modern secular context, the focus is not going to scriptural sources, albeit of course the Judeo-Christian tradition has strongly influenced the development of Western culture, but it's trying to discover what human rights are as human beings. So human beings having more of an authority to discover or determine their own destiny. So therein lies really the fundamental clash with Islam and modernity. So I noticed there was a question mark on that poster out there. Does Islam clash with modernity? Well, yes, I think it does. I think that's what the problem is with Islam, that Islam is seen as the major world contender with modernity for sort of the globalized secularist culture there is today, because there is precisely this difference, whereas in the sort of globalized, secularized culture that is very common today, and which is culturally dominant today in many regions of the world, the focus is on the human and belief is a personal matter, whereas I would say traditionally in Islamic thought, and my view as a Muslim, I believe the authentic way to look at Islam is that the divine is the center of both the private and the public, and the revelation should inform the direction of the society. Now I'm being slightly cautious in my choice of words, because there's obviously a lot of differences of opinion among Muslims. There's, even regarding something like secularism, you'll find different viewpoints, or modernity. But I think it's reasonable to say at least that a good number of the world's Muslims do genuinely feel that Islam should have an impact on how their society runs. For example, the legal system. I would say a good number of Muslims would like family law, for example, to be done by Sharia in one way or another. And this, of course, is quite different to what we see in the sort of globalized, secularized culture. So yes, there's a big conflict between Islam and modernity. I mean, ideally, now I don't want to get too abstract here, but ideally there shouldn't be, in that kind of the sort of, the philosophical trend in Western thought was very idealistic in my opinion, and the idea was people could discover the truth on their own. And this is basically a sort of unspoken belief in a lot of Islamic thought, the idea that because religion is supposed to be in agreement with reason, that if someone had a perfect intellect, they would come to the same conclusions that the revelation says. So this is ideal, but of course, in reality, people's intellects don't work like that. We have all sorts of biases and so forth.
Which aspects of modernity are you referring to? Because the rates in abstract seems Islam is old and modernity is new. So there are certain aspects that the clash you are referring to. Maybe it's better to just
yes. The primary aspect I'm referring to now is the taking the revelation as the source of direction for society and focusing on the divine and obedience to God as sort of the center of society and private life, versus the secularist model, which basically says that religion does not belong in the public sphere, and more of a focus on the nation state and human beings determining their own destiny. So that's what I mean by the clash here. And I think that's a real clash. I also, personally, I don't have a problem with that. I don't lose any sleep over that, because it's okay to disagree. There's a lot of people in the world. There are different ways of living. We don't have to hate each other for disagreeing. I can respect someone who has a difference of opinion. Now we do live in a world, I'm just going to be very honest here, indeed I try to be, where we're sort of socialized to view modernity as a very positive word. There are all sorts of words we're socialized to believe are positive: modernity, progress, technology, democracy, etc. So it's as if you're against any of those things, then you're somehow bad. There's a value judgment. I'm not saying it's bad that Islam clashes with modernity in some ways. I'm saying it is, and there are multiple ways to live life, and that's the human condition. So there are, I think, some real areas where Islam and modernity do clash. Now if we want to just expand modernity and get a little bit out of this philosophical framework stuff into the dominant sort of globalized, secularized culture? I would say yes, there are some differences in values between values that are encouraged by the scriptural sources of Islam. That is to say, the Holy Quran, which is the primary scriptural source, being considered divine revelation by Muslims, and also the hadith, or the sayings of the Holy Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him and his family. There are things that are advocated by those which are not popular in today's globalized, secularized culture, and in particular, in a lot of the world media, or especially the Western media, are oftentimes portrayed very negatively. There are some very easy examples. Okay, head covering. You wouldn't believe how controversial a piece of cloth is, but there's a lot of symbolism around head covering, obviously. And I do believe the negativity towards head covering in the West is due to a perception, which I think does come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, that head covering for women is associated, well, maybe more from the Christian tradition anyway, associated with submissiveness and a sort of lower status for women. So therefore, in the feminist movement, there's an idea that to be free, women should uncover their hair. So there's that symbolism. In Islamic world, head covering in and of itself doesn't symbolize that. For that matter, if you go to the Middle East, for example, you find many men cover their hair too, because quite frankly, it's hot and the sun beats down on you in a lot of countries. Not implying that most of the Muslims are in the Middle East. I'm well aware that most Muslims live in Southeast Asia and also the subcontinent, but I'm just saying that so sort of the paradigm is different. But in any case, for some reason, this seems to be directed at Muslims a lot, that in order to be free, a woman should uncover her hair. Really, it doesn't make a difference. It has nothing to do with my intellect or freedom or what I wear on my head. But the point is, this is a value clash, albeit a small issue. There are other issues that have nothing to do with women directly. Sharia is a big one. If I'm allowed to say that in here, I know Sharia has become a bad word nowadays in some of the media in some countries. You know, say, oh, the Sharia law is coming and we have to fight this Sharia law. And it's odd to see this. I'm fortunate to be old enough now to remember when Sharia was not a bad word. For those of us who are Muslims, we understand that Sharia is just the way we live life according to how we understand the revelation. So it's the religious law. And most of it has nothing to do with hand chopping and so forth. A lot of it's just very basic things, how you pray, how you fast. Also, there are legislative matters too. I'm not pushing that aside. The transaction laws, whatever. But the point is, it's not seen as a negative thing. It's generally seen as a positive thing by practicing Muslims, because the main idea of Islam is to try to obey God, to obey Allah. And the way you do that is by doing what Allah has commanded, what we understand, and you do that by following the Sharia. However, there is this negativity towards Sharia nowadays in some circles outside of the Islamic world. Well, outside of Muslims, I don't want to generalize about the Islamic world. Personally, I'm of the view, I really think this goes back to some of the clash between Christianity and Islam, and that I do feel there's a certain amount of negativity towards a formalized religious law, and maybe this has to do more with Judaism and Christianity in my sense, or in a sense, I think. And there's a sense that a religion that has a strong religious law is not necessarily so spiritual and so forth. I think that's where some of these perceptions might come from. But in any case, it's a clash. Obviously, in the secular world, religiously oriented law isn't supposed to be directing a society. So if you have a society that does wish to be directed by that, you have a clash. We could go on all day about clashes between Islam and modernity. I'm just simply pointing out that they are there. In general, with regards to women or not about women. Now, since I'm also supposed to tackle another giant subject, which is women in the Holy Quran, we're now going to move to that subject. And I would like to point out, first of all, while fully observing that there are definitely, in my humble opinion, genuine clashes between Islam and modernity, including with regards to ideals regarding women or other aspects of social life, family life, and so forth, there are also some ways in which Islamic thought has changed in the past century or so. That is to say, while, again, as Muslims, for those of us who are practicing Muslims, we believe that, as the Holy Quran says, the religion before Allah is Islam, and Islam. So Islam is Allah knows the Islam. But we as human beings, we may evolve in our understanding of what Islam is. For example, if you go back 500 years, you find some of the ulama, they said different things than Muslims do nowadays, and some of the things they said are the same. Because just as human beings, our understanding, our discussion, the trends of thought change. So I'm not going to be saying that Islam itself is changing in the modern era. As a Muslim, from a faith-based perspective, I don't believe that. I believe Islam is Islam. But what I would say is some of the way we discuss things, the paradigms or the approaches, have been changing. And this is particularly true with regards to discussion about women. It should be also fairly obvious why the paradigms have been changing a lot. Primarily because the sort of social situation of women has changed so radically in the past century. And people in general. I mean, if you look at urbanization and mass education and so forth, our lives are much different than most of our grandparents, I'm sure, or great-grandparents. And so when you have such a radical shift in situation, it sort of shakes up your ideas about the world, and you have to sometimes reevaluate things. And I think what a very easy answer, or a very easy example to give is, again, a very simple example, and that is, again, the headscarf, a very over-discussed example. And that is, if you go back 100 years, I think it would be very difficult for you to find Islamic scholars saying the purpose of the headscarf or the Islamic modest dress is for women to interact in society and be a positive member of society, to participate in the society. Because women's participation in society wasn't really necessarily encouraged in a number of Muslim regions. Now again, that's a generalization. I'm not talking about every female, but it does seem that in the sort of 19th century, early 20th century, there was a very restrictive sort of attitude with regards to women in a number of Muslim countries. Something, incidentally, I don't personally think traces all the way back to, say, the medieval era. I think this is a lot of societies became more restrictive as the modern era neared. In any case, other topic. So you won't find that, but nowadays it's quite common if you listen to a lecture about the hijab or Islamic modest dress for someone to say the purpose of the hijab is so a woman can go into society and interact with people like I'm doing right now without being objectified or treated with indignity, and so people can understand her intellect and see her as a human being. So this is a very different way of discussing the hijab. Now, has Islam changed in the past 100 years? No, but it's just people's assumptions that they're bringing to the table about discussing Islam that have changed. And in part, I think, again, due to the difference in social situation. And also, realistically, people need to change their paradigms sometimes when they no longer work. And that's something I'm going to get to, because I'm going to have an honesty moment, and I'm aware that we Muslims do not like airing our dirty laundry, so to speak. I don't know if that's an Americanism or not, but I'm just going to be honest. There are times when we discuss religion, and what we say theoretically doesn't always match what happens in the society. And again, it has nothing to do with what Islam is or what the Holy Quran says. It's just sometimes the approaches we take don't mirror what happens. One of my favorite examples, I hope this, probably because I'm a female, but one of my favorite examples is when I'm listening to a religious speech and someone is saying, yes, in Islam, women don't have to work, but they can work if they want to. Great. Now, I agree. According to Sharia, a father should support his unmarried daughter and a husband should support his wife. But, come on. I work because I have to, and I have to pay my rent. And I know a lot of women who work because we have to. So there's a gap between the way things are discussed theoretically versus what actually happens in some people's lives. And quite frankly, that can be very alienating for a lot of people. And I'm just going to be honest, that sometimes pushes women away from the Muslim community a little bit if they find there's too much of a gap between theory and practice. So in any case, I'm going to discuss some shifts in thought, and then I'm going to discuss them from a Quranic perspective, because that's what I'm supposed to do. And of course, these are areas where we can get into maybe a bit of debate too. Inshallah, debate is fine. Okay, so one of the paradigms that we see, I don't know when it started, to be honest, but when you look at, say, mid-20th century discussion about women in Islam, one of the things we see is that there's a lot of discussion of women as roles instead of as human beings. So for those of you who do listen to Islamic lectures regularly, have any of you not heard the lecture that says that women are valuable in Islam because women are valued as wives, daughters, and mothers? You've all heard that, right? You know, our Fatima Zahra is a role model as a wife, daughter, and mother. We hear this all the time. Those are all very good things. Islamic teachings emphasize family values. Family is important. Kids are very cute, mashallah. I've seen a few around here. And family roles are, you know, we have a hadith about responsibilities of a husband and a wife and a father and a mother and every members of the family. This is important. But there gets to be a slight problem when you only identify women as roles and not as people. Because we as women, we take on many roles in life. Honestly, probably several times a day. At one time of the day, you may be acting like a mommy. At one time, you may be at work. At one time, you may be a daughter. So we fulfill many roles throughout our lives because that's what we are as human beings. But in the end, we aren't a role. We are a person. And I think, I have my own theories about why this became a very popular trend of thought in relatively recent Islamic thought. But I think one of the people who did sort of pinpoint this a little bit, if I'm allowed to say his name, is Dr. Shariati. That was a bit of a joke because he has so many enemies, the poor guy. He died fairly young and everyone hates him. Incidentally, I mean, you know, I think it's good to consider any figure and take the good and leave what's not so good. I'm not saying everything he said was perfect, but he had some good ideas. And you may be familiar with his book, Fatima is Fatima, where he's speaking about Fatima Zahra, peace be upon her, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, who very frequently is only discussed as a role and less often as just sort of who she was as an actual person. And he points out at the end that although she excels at all of these roles, and we can look at her as a model daughter, or a model wife, or a model mother, and these are all very useful things to do, to get guidance in daily life. He says she's also something beyond that, and finally he concludes Fatima is Fatima, so she's herself. But I think he sort of pinpointed the issue right there. And quite frankly, for those of you who've read that book, and I bet a number of you have, thankfully some of the issues he mentions are no longer issues anymore. Like he speaks about illiteracy among women, which is not so much of an issue nowadays. He wrote the book, I think, in the 50s or 60s. I think in the 60s or early 60s. I mean, he gave his speeches anyway. Anyway, back some time ago. But some of the issues he mentions really still are issues that I think we face as Muslims today, which is kind of sad. But in any case, he pinpointed that issue there. And there is, while maintaining important discussions about family roles, and quite frankly, I think it's also good to have discussions about ideals of femininity and masculinity in Islamic thought. One of my soapboxes I get on occasionally is we have so many speeches about Islam and women. When do we have speeches about Islam and men? No, really, seriously. I've heard one in my life, and it was so inspiring that I went out and I gave one once when I was asked to speak about Islam and women. I said, okay, manhood is its own subject. There's a lot to speak about being a man. And I wasn't sure how well it would go over being female and all, so I was trying to be very tactful, and because I don't understand, obviously, the male experience. I'm just saying what's in the hadith and so forth, Qur'an and hadith. But actually, it went over well, so that was nice. But the point is, these are their own discussion. But also, when it comes to women, there needs to be something beyond that. And again, that may be, it may have been in the past. I'm honestly not sure. But it may have been in the past, like if you go back, maybe in the olden days when girls got married at 11 years old and stuff, that it really didn't matter if you talked about women only, say, as wives, because that was sort of the society. But in any case, in an era where marriage is quite delayed for a lot of women, there are a lot of young women who just aren't really gonna feel in sync with that definition of being a woman, because they may be, say, 23 years old and at university, and they're not necessarily fulfilling any of these roles, so they want something else. Now, whether that delay in marriage is positive or negative is an entirely other subject. I'm just saying this is the reality of the world we're in right now. So that's one thing, but of course the more important thing is the Holy Quran. And what we notice about the Quranic discussion of women, if you really just approach it sort of dealing with it on its own and not bringing in other things. Really, it does treat men and women basically as human beings. In fact, I think it's quite notable that the Holy Quran does not assign gender roles to people. It doesn't say, for example, women, you should cook, and men, you should, I don't know, hunt or something. Now, I'm pointing out, incidentally, I'm not against gender roles. I think it makes life a lot easier to have defined gender roles. But the point is, this is not something prescribed by the Holy Quran, or even by the Hadith necessarily, but it's just a means of sort of figuring out how you're going to live your life, because you need some sort of order. In fact, if you look at a lot of the women in the Holy Quran, they actually really defy a lot of traditional gender roles. In fact, a number of them are really exceptional in that regard. And by exceptional, I really mean being exceptions. So, for example, the Queen of Sheba, Bilqis, I mean, she's a queen, she's got armies, she's chieftains. She's not really the typical woman, and certainly she doesn't fit into this typical model. Maryam, the Virgin Mary, again, according to the Islamic tradition, when she has the virgin birth, she's not married, and she doesn't marry. So this is a little bit, she's not engaged or anything. And according to the Quranic story, she's basically sent, she's dedicated to the temple, and so she goes in service, which is a very iconoclastic position for a woman to be in, because that's a male realm. So there's a lot of things about the women in the Quran that are they're sort of opposite to some of these gender roles. Perhaps it's just a recognition that women do come in all sorts of roles and situations in life. So if we go basically from the creation to the resurrection, and since as Muslims we believe Allah created the universe and Allah will resurrect us in the hereafter and send us to the good place or the bad place. Inshallah, we'll all go to the good place depending on our deeds. And one thing that's also very notable about the creation story in the Holy Quran, now incidentally, I'm not getting into tafsir right now, that's complicated. I just want to point out what's in the Quran, is that the creation story is not gendered. O humankind, we created you from one soul, and then we created of the same kind its mate, zawjaha, and then from these two we spread out a lot of people, males and females. It's actually, in my opinion, it's quite striking, because Arabic, as you know, is a very heavily gendered language. And yet this doesn't really have any connotation even about who has primacy in the creation, the male or the female. It just says we created the soul and its mate. Now, of course, there are a number of explanations in Sunni and Shi'i Hadith and tafsir you can go into later if you want. But the point is, it doesn't really assign any creational difference between males and females, which is, maybe different than, so a lot of times when we think about being male or being female, we just sort of picture a sort of creational difference. And this is expressed elsewhere. For example, the very oftentimes recited ayah, which unfortunately not all people in the world still take seriously, even all Muslims, that, human beings, we've created you in male and female and in different tribes and nations, so that you know each other, and the most honorable of you before Allah is the most highest. Yes, now one of the reasons why this verse or this ayah is so often cited is because it's a sort of anti-racism verse. It reminds us that no one people is better than another, and we're all created different, with cultural differences and difference of gender, so we come to know each other. Also as one of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, I'm pointing out people don't always take that on board, because there is obviously still issues with racism and nationalism and whatnot. I don't personally think that it's accidental that race and gender are mentioned together in this verse. Many people, I think, would agree that racial prejudice has a lot of the same dynamics as gender prejudice. This is why a lot of times you speak about women and minorities, even though we're a majority in the world. There are more women, as far as I know, than men, but we tend to be a bit more disempowered, like a racial minority. But also that this is just part of the beauty of the creation of God, and the best of us is the one who is most honorable. So this continues. I mean, I don't want to go through every single verse about women in the Quran, because we'll be here a long time. If you look at the social responsibilities in general, it's also outlined as the same. I mean, there's a very famous verse, you know, إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, etc. Basically, specifically saying that men and women, and it's specifying women, because, you know, there are some parts of the Holy Quran, as those of you who are familiar with it know, where although there's no need grammatically to specify females, nonetheless it is specified to emphasize that these verses refer to men and women. It's saying basically they have the same spiritual and ethical responsibilities. And it's said that this verse was revealed on account of a woman asking about where are women in the Revelation. So, like I said, these are not modern issues. People have been asking about them since the inception of Islam. And there are other verses. For example, there's a verse about the believing men and the believing women, that they are protectors of each other. This is in Surah At-Tawbah. They enjoin what is good, one of the religious duties, enjoining the good, forbidding the evil, and establishing the prayer, and so forth. So there's really a lot of parallelism between the way women and men are discussed. Also in terms of, unfortunately, those who go to the other place when they pass on, the hypocritical men and women, they're equally chastised, so no gender preference there. And so on. There's one exception, really, to the way men and women, to this sort of parallelism where men and women are discussed, and that is when it comes to family law. For example, you have the famous, heck, in some circles nowadays, infamous verse, الرجال قوامون على النساء. That didn't come out as disrespectful, by the way. You know, astaghfirullah, I don't believe the Quran is infamous. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that because people argue about that verse so much. Men are, you can say, the maintainers of women. At least from the context of the verse, it does seem to be saying that men had ought to be responsible for their families and be manly by providing for their families and protecting their families, because that's what a man does. Inshallah, in the Islamic thought at least. So when it comes to family law or some issues of divorce, and if the woman is carrying a child and these kinds of things, there are some differences. But in general, when it comes to the humanity and the creation and the life of the people, there is a strong parallelism. So therefore, because this is rather obvious in the Quran, if you look at it, and also because the paradigm of treating women solely as roles just doesn't work for a lot of people anymore. Although it does work for some people, you still hear it. But I think this is one of the aspects in which Islamic thought has been changing in the light of modernity. So again, I'm not talking about Islam changing, and I certainly don't feel that we have to try to mold Islam to fit modernity or even to fit modern realities, but simply that there is evolution of thought, and it's not something new. It's been going on since the beginning of Islam and in every other religion too. So I'm not sure how long I'm supposed to be talking here. Do we want another paradigm that's changed, or should we open up the floor for questions?
We can continue in another 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Well, I have to summarize another trend of thought in 5 minutes. Okay, this one, quite frankly, in my humble opinion, this one comes across a bit as airing more dirty laundry, so to speak. I hope that metaphor is not too disrespectful either. I'm originally from America, so I'm very casual. There's another trend of thought that became very popular in the 20th century, or like 50s, that time, regarding men and women, males and females. Now, again, I'm not sure how far, and you do find traces of it in classical thought, so I'm not saying it's new, but it seems to really have been codified in this time period. And that is this paradigm that says that men and women are separate but equal, and men have the intellect and women have the emotion. So this is why men need to be in control of women, because we're somehow dominated by our intellect and we can't make our decisions, and our intellect is not high enough to be the man's. Now this was sort of a common means of thought. I'm going to point out, this is not this is not an idea that Muslims invented. You go back in the heritage and European literature and so forth, you find people saying things like women can't go to university because they could never succeed intellectually. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a society where women are not allowed to get an education, then of course they're going to be intellectually less than men. And to the credit, and by the way, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone, but to the credit of those who advocated these ideas, they were living in a time when many women were not educated or even literate, or at least their parents, or mothers or grandmothers weren't. So, this is what they saw and this is what they said. But one reason this doesn't, in my opinion, work anymore is simply because we've disproved it on a practical level. we now live in the 21st century, right? Yes, 21st century, where even in much of the Muslim world, women are at least on the same level as men, sometimes even outperforming men in intellectual tasks. So, okay, the idea that women are somehow like not intellectually there doesn't really apply, and sometimes women don't like it when we're told this sort of thing. But there's also another implication, which I think also needs to be considered, and there's an implication that intellect is good and emotion is bad. So intellect will sort of guide you and emotion will mislead you. So there's also that value judgment there. Now, quite frankly, I think, this is my personal theory, I think that in part was spurred as a response to modernity, in that one of the sort of defining concepts of modernity is it's the intellect that's going to lead us in terms of progress and all this spirituality, intuition, etc. that's for the past. So by saying intellect is good and emotion is bad, it's kind of the same sort of thing. I mean, it's in the same era. We see a lot of these books about the Quran and science and scientific miracles in the Quran and proving the Quran through science, which is an interesting field of study. It's quite fascinating to see how scientific discoveries do parallel the Holy Quran. At one time in my life, I had the privilege of teaching astrophysics, and so it's fun to look at these things. But obviously, faith is something different from science. The science can sort of bolster your faith. You say, wow, I didn't know that Quran sort of matches this scientific theory, but that's not really the purpose of faith. It's just sort of like frosting, so to speak. In any case, so this idea sort of came out. But also there's, and it doesn't necessarily always work in today's world. And even if you look at some of the more recent scholarship from people who are still considered to be fairly conservative. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the scholar by the name of Mahdi Mahrizi, I believe. He writes mostly in Farsi, because I'm doing my PhD on hadith, he writes a lot about hadith and women. So I've looked through some of his work. I noticed he's sort of very delicately sort of disproved this paradigm in some areas. So, you see it changing, but you also see the paradigm used quite a bit in this idea of this essential difference between men and women. I do incidentally think there are some differences between the way men and women commonly do think, but I don't think it's as simple as intellect versus emotion. But now we get to the Holy Quran, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about, and I don't feel that the Quran supports this paradigm. First of all, with regards to the intellect is not assigned to the male or the female in the Holy Quran. And indeed, in the Islamic tradition, the intellect is supposed to be one of the sort of the sense that leads someone towards faith, so it does have a faith aspect. But both men and women in the Holy Quran have the intellect. In fact, really, most people in the Holy Quran have a fair amount of intellect. And again, a very classic example is the Queen of Sheba, in that she's very sharp in how she deals with Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. So, for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the Quranic version of the story, she's ruling a queendom, which is sun worshippers, so they don't worship God. And then the Prophet Sulaiman alayhi salam, he finds out about this. He sends her a letter inviting her to worship Allah and become a monotheist. So she basically has to decide what to do, and there's the question of should they go to war, and she's very conscious of the consequences of war. She considers her different options. She tests Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, and then after the end of sort of exploring everything, she decides that she's convinced that Sulaiman alayhi salam is a prophet, and she should worship Allah. So in the end, she's portrayed as being very intellectually there. Or even if you look at an example like the mother of Moses, or Musa, obviously her situation is quite different. She gives birth to this baby, and she's in a situation where the Pharaoh is killing all of the babies, so from the children of Israel, so she needs to put the baby in the river Nile, because this is the divine inspiration or revelation that has been given to her. Now, of course, this is not really what a mother wants to do. Mothers don't normally put their children in the river and just set them adrift, even if they trust that Allah will take care of them, because it's against your emotions. But obviously she doesn't act emotionally and say, no, it's my child, I can't do that. She obeys Allah. But then also you see there's some respect for her emotions too. One of the tafsirs of saying that her heart was empty, some of the professors say it's because her heart was sad, because her child was gone, and Allah comforts her and takes care of that. But that gets to the point where, first of all, I've just mentioned a couple examples where women do act with intellect in the Holy Quran, and there's nothing that says they don't. But also, emotions are not portrayed as a bad thing. Now, of course, in the Islamic tradition, unrestrained emotion is a bad thing, especially things like anger and hatred, these things you have to control. But emotion in general is actually portrayed as a characteristic of the prophets. And by that I mean the male prophets. It's in the Holy Quran, and especially it's in the Hadith. I haven't done a comparative study, but I think it's even more strongly in the Shi'i Hadith, whereby one of the aspects of the perfection of the prophets is this very deep sense of emotion and empathy and compassion and so forth. So for example, Nabi Yaqub, or Jacob, alayhi salam, we know in the Holy Quran that he cries so much over Yusuf, over Joseph, that he goes blind. Now that's very emotional, obviously, because he's crying, and even though he knows that Joseph is alive, but still, because he's at this level of perfection, he has this level of emotion. For example, from the Hadith, one Hadith that always sticks in my mind, it's about when the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his young son died, so he had the young son named Ibrahim, and his son dies, so he sheds some tears when his son has died, and he's seeing him. So some of the companions, I guess, felt this is not a very manly thing for the Holy Prophet to be doing, men crying over their children, so they say, Ya Rasulullah, what's going on here? So he has to explain to them that this is the softness and the compassion of the heart, and Allah has put these feelings into the hearts of people, and basically it's okay. So what I'm pointing out is just in this very brief survey that the Holy Quran doesn't really support this paradigm. First of all, that intellect and emotion are sort of divvied out half and half between men and women. But also it doesn't say that one is bad and one is good. They're sort of working in harmony as long as it's the right sort of emotion. And even the intellect can go the wrong way. I'm going to quote the Shi'i tradition now. There's a hadith speaking about the intellect, which is generally described as something that leads someone to Allah. And then someone asks, well, what about so-and-so person who was very crafty and very deceitful? And they said, well, the response was, that's not actually the intellect that leads someone towards Allah, that's just someone who has a very deceptive mind. So the mind itself, it's like technology, it can be used for good or bad. But it's the same thing with the emotion too. In any case, I think this is a change in paradigm that has occurred in the past century. I think it is occurring. And like I said, there are many voices among Muslims. I'm not saying everyone has changed paradigms. You find a lot of different viewpoints. But I do think this is the direction it is going, and these have been some trends of thought. And quite frankly, I think these are issues we don't discuss often enough because, again, as Muslims, the entire Islamic world has been on the defensive for about 200 years with the sort of colonialism and European invasion of Muslim countries, cultural colonialism. It's a very real thing that during the colonialist era, that attacks on Islam were used to politically and militarily dominate Muslim countries and to get the resources. So Muslims have been very reactionary, we Muslims, for the past couple hundred years. And the fact of the matter is, when you are defensive, you can't really engage in a critical analysis of your ideas. And I think we're still in the same situation today. And this is particularly sharp with regards to gender issues, because as Muslims, there is a perception, and I think it's a real perception, that in many cases, women's issues are used as a way to attack Islam or Muslims. So for example, you have the US invasion of Afghanistan to save Muslim women from the Taliban, which I'm not praising the Taliban, but I'm saying women's issues are used as a sort of a cover for military operations or other incursions into Muslim countries. So the response to that is to sort of fight back and to say, for example, well, gender equality is Western, so we're not going to believe in gender equality. Men and women are separate but equal. They're not equal. And it's sort of a very adamant, politicized sort of thing. But again, when we're in that defensive position, it doesn't allow us to have some of the discussions that I think we do need to have about things like women in the Quran and so forth. So speaking of discussions, I think I've discussed more than enough, so I'm looking forward to hearing some of the questions or discussions. I think what Brother Ahmed was saying, if I can be so uncouth as to rephrase it, he's saying we have to be polite and not cuss when we're discussing. So inshallah we'll be polite, and thank you for your attention.
much, Sister Inloes, for your insightful lecture. We really enjoyed it. There were quite a few new reflections, at least for me, food for thought. But we open up the floor. If you have any questions, you can either ask verbally. If you want to ask your questions verbally, I would ask you to please go next to the camera so that it can be, your voice can be recorded. Or the brothers have paper and pen. You can also write them written form. I'm going to read it out. So we're going to go first come, first serve.
Would you please? I think I can. You should. Would you please? Is it good?
Yes, that's good. We also have survey forms going around, so please fill the survey forms for the end of the Yes. Sir.
All right. So, thank you very much for this nice talk. Would you please address those controversial, verses? For example, the verse that you read, Al-Rijal Qawwamun an-Nisa. Okay, so because these are really controversial. About the other verses, there is no problem. Okay, so but how do you interpret those controversial verses?
Can you be more specific? Because you said verses.
Yeah.
Do you mean that particular verse?
This one, or for example, inheritance law, right?
Okay, so now we have two verses.
Two verses. Okay, I can bring more.
Yeah.
No, if you can.
Okay, well, we'll stop with two because that's probably enough. Yeah. First of all, I'd like to just comment on the controversial part. Now, as a Muslim, this is another faith-based statement. I do not believe in taking a defensive or apologetic stance to discussing religion. So if I'm going to, and I'm not blaming you by the way, I'm saying 99% of the time when someone asks you to discuss women in Islam, quite frankly, this happened to me in London about a week before I came here, they give you a list of these verses and say, we're going to discuss women in Islam. So I want you to talk about why Islam is not unfair to women because of the inheritance verse, the witnesses verse, the Daraba verse, what other verses? There are, a few verses that always come up. And you sort of you start on the defensive posture saying why Islam is not bad. Happens in other areas too. I'm sure some of us have had to sort of give a presentation about why Muslims are not terrorists or this or that. So you're already starting with the attack and the response. I don't like that. I like to start with a clean slate. So if I want to talk about women in the Holy Quran in general, I would probably start just with creation, for example, and some of the verses I talked about now, maybe women in the Quran, but just go through what's there. And then if these verses come up, I discuss them. Again, I'm not attacking you because this is always what happens, but I'm just making that point because I think it is an important point. And I think it's also, in a sense, you have to direct the dialogue because in so much as you allow people to define the dialogue for you, for example, to put you in a position where you have to respond and prove yourself, then you don't have control. And I think when you're discussing your own faith, it's good to maintain a modicum of control. Anyway, so back to the subject. Okay, this verse that you mentioned, I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of questions. And there are a lot of points where you can stop in this verse and discuss many points that professors have disagreed about over the centuries. So if I remember the verse, so الرجال قوامون على النساء, men are, the translation that's most popular nowadays is protectors and maintainers of women. Now there are other interpretations.
What about the continuation of the verse?
Yeah.
You don't think the rest part is important?
I'm just beginning. We'll be here all night probably. But I will be all night, I'll summarize. I'm saying, now this honestly has been interpreted by scholars in basically two ways. One of them, it just means men are in charge of women, full stop. So women shouldn't be in politics because men are in charge of women. Women should not be doctors because men are in charge of women. Women should not be firefighters because men are in charge of women, because women are supposed to be inside the house or sort of incapable or whatever. Now again, I'm not quoting the scriptural sources of Islam, I'm just giving views of people throughout the centuries. And you can track how interpretations of this verse have changed throughout the centuries as ideas about women evolved. Because it does seem that in the early period of Islam, I would say the community was a lot more gender egalitarian than it was after, say, the first 400 years. a lot of ideas about restrictions on women became quite common in Islamic thought. Okay, so the other interpretation, which I think is more in keeping with the verse and is also more favored today, is that this is really just about family life, and because the rest of the verse is about the marital life, that men should be responsible for their families. Okay, بِمَا فَضَّلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ, for what Allah has favored one over the other. Well, that's another issue. Who is one over the other? If you look at the Yusuf Ali translation, which is the most common translation of the Holy Quran, he says, by what Allah has favored men over women. So he says, I think, strength. So he says, okay, Allah gives men muscles, Allah gives men, I don't know, maybe intellect, whatever it is. So therefore, that's why men are the maintainers of women. I asked a scholar who's an expert in the Quran, whose opinion I greatly respect, about this verse once, and his view was that this is not men over women, but it's just Allah's favored some men over others, or some women over others too, and that, for example, some men are very strong, some men are not very, very strong, some men are very brave, some are not very brave. People, they're not all equals, and even between men and women, some women are stronger than some men, etc. So he didn't feel it has that interpretation, albeit that one is quite popular. Just the rest of the verse. Right, yes, and that again is referring to the maintaining of the family. So men are maintainers of women because of what they spend for their families. I think we can all agree that's a good thing, and it seems to be fairly obvious that one of the gender differences we cannot deny is ladies have children, and even if the dad's going to be Mr. Mom, the lady still gets pregnant and has an infant, and in the older days at least there weren't many options to feeding it the old-fashioned way. So it's not really fair to have to send women out to the workforce when they've got a 2-week-old infant or something. Now, of course, again, historically, many women have had to work on farms and so forth, regardless of how many young children they have. But the idea is, I think it's reasonable to say that if you look at the Islamic model, men should provide for their families because women do bear children, and very frequently we are usually the caretakers of women. Sometimes it happens, sometimes men prefer to have that position, and of course that's personal, but that's just generally how it works. And pregnant women are sometimes tired and so forth, so it's not always good for the baby to do strenuous labor and whatnot. So men should be providing for their families. Of course it happens that they can't always, but ideally they should try at least. That goes to the women. Oh, right. Okay, the righteous salihat, the righteous qanitat, righteous obedient women. Oh, that's a whole other issue. Yeah, I'm actually gonna. Can someone thank you?
Excuse me, sorry.
Yeah.
This is great, that you are going through details, but my question is general, right?
Oh.
So how do you treat those verses? Okay. So, for example, do you think that because there are two, or at least I know two different point of views, all right? So some people say that okay, so this is applicable to the situation that people live back there, all right? And it's not applicable to our daily life, okay?
Yeah.
So we have to okay. So sometimes some people say that okay, so we have to neglect those, for example, verses, right? Which I don't agree. Or some people try to interpret it in different ways to match it with our daily life. Okay, what's your opinion, all right?
I got it. I'm so sorry I was not answering the question.
This is a great idea that going through this detail, and maybe we'll discuss together,
Yeah, well,
after a while.
we didn't get to the fun parts of the verse yet. Okay.
After you answer this question, if you could go back, please.
Okay.
You could try. I'm really enjoying. Okay, so just I thought that maybe you want to keep some time, for other questions.
Yeah, no, because it is discussing this verse, and quite frankly, this verse is discussed a lot by a lot of people. Yeah, okay, so his question, if I'm understanding it correctly, your question, is whether these verses for a believing and practicing Muslim should be considered as applicable today, or were they socially and culturally contextualized and good for the 7th century and not good for today? Okay, now the sort of general answer, taking into account there's 1.4 billion Muslims, is there are differences of opinion. There are people today who feel these verses are socially contextualized. There are very few aspects of Sharia, I'm not talking about these verses, that aren't really done today. Very few. But I mean by the more traditional scholars. I don't believe in the social contextualization theory, personally. I mean, from a faith perspective, I believe that as a Muslim, the divine revelation is the divine revelation, and it is, and you follow it, because the job of a Muslim is to submit to Allah. That's what Islam means, submission to Allah. So if the Quran says this is my inheritance, then that's my inheritance, and that's it. I mean, that's how I feel personally. You can call it a fundamentalist view or whatever. So I'm not in favor of the trends of thought which do actually reinterpret the legalistic aspects which are specified by the verses. Now I'm actually being very, again, picky about my words, because for example in some schools of thought you use qiyas and you say, okay, so the inheritance of a woman is like this in this situation, so let's extend that to something else in life or whatever. That's a whole different issue, because now you're getting into interpretation, and there's no guarantee that someone's interpretation, say in the 4th century, is more correct than someone's interpretation today. And of course that brings up the issue of ijtihad, which I think realistically many Muslims today do agree, regardless of their school of thought, that ijtihad is a necessity. Obviously in the Sunni schools of thought, the fiqh was codified, but there is still ijtihad practically with regards to modern issues. And it's a topic of discussion. In the Shia school of thought, ijtihad is generally embraced, and there's no view that, say, the 5th century opinion is more or less valid than ours today. What's important is to present your proof and to try to come to the meaning of the verse. So yes, I take the verses as they are. However, there is, of course, the question of interpretation. For example, the verse that you were mentioning, sort of skipping to the end of the verse, the most debated part of the verse is whether men can hit their wives. So you have the verse, the verb daraba, meaning oftentimes 1 second, meaning to hit. That's one meaning of hit. There's also the viewpoint which has been discussed in the modern era. I can't remember offhand if it's a classical view. It may have been. Many sort of new views that come up nowadays really existed in the classical era too, which also means, doesn't mean hit, it means something else. So that's just a question of understanding the grammar and trying to come to the meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended. I think that's fine. I mean, that means trying to understand the faith. We do have some new tools nowadays, such as computers, which help us analyze a lot of Islamic texts faster. So that's an area I do think that can be done. I mean, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that some people might have had some cultural bias or something when making conclusions from these verses. I do think sometimes people take these verses and run with them. Like, for example, there's the controversial verse about the witnesses, that when you take a loan, take 2 men as the witnesses for the transaction, and if you don't have 2 men, then take 1 man and 2 women. And of course, people take that and say, well, a woman is half a man. And no, the verse doesn't say a woman is half a man. It says in this situation, when you're taking a loan, have 1 man and 2 women as witnesses. It's not even talking about every transaction. It's talking about that transaction. Why it is, I mean, Allah knows. And you see so many people give their personal opinions. I mean, I've heard really everything with regards to why that is the way it is. And I mean, there is some virtue in speculating, but sometimes people build up big edifices on their speculations, and I don't think that's healthy. So I just take these at face value. It says what it says, and if people find it controversial, I'm middle-aged now, and I don't really care anymore. This is life. I mean, everyone's going to have their issue. But I acknowledge there are some Muslim thinkers who do offer the social contextualization argument. It's just not one I believe personally. And I don't think it's really in concordance with the spirit of Islamic thought. Did you want to say something or ask something?
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure listening to you. And I congratulate you. You're really a good goddess of Islam. And I don't have any objection with what you said about the hadith in Quran and so on. But I have some questions about the hypothesis that some of them I wrote here for myself because it was so fast that I couldn't catch most of them.
Sorry.
First of all, the truth is different from what people understand. Islam is something else, and then understanding is something else. So it means that each of the, well, let's say, during the past 1,000 years, nobody understood it. So, and the other that I understood was about the modernity and the before modernity, it was a break between, let's say, the authority of God and revelation and the authority of human being. Like humanist is taking place. Well, I don't see that like that because even after that or before that, even now in Islam, if you understand that the understanding of Islam is different from Islam and understanding of Christianity is different from Christianity, then you can say that the understanding of the revelation was changed with another understanding of reality.
Okay.
Okay? So what's there is no break. It's only what I think now, because you build up most of the things that you said on top of this hypothesis. And the other one that I realized that you insisted that in Quran women and men are the same and in many things, and okay, they are equal, but in social rights, that it comes sometimes that الرجال قوامون على النساء. And you also mentioned the phrase called وخلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلنا شعوبا recited well. But why do you think that in this verse it says ذكر أو أنثى? So it is different. Like you say that, well, maybe you can say that tall or short people, okay. But tall or short people, they don't have different social rights. And all the philosophy that comes for equality goes after to justify the rights of the social, but for themselves per se doesn't have any meaning.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying. If I'm not understanding it, then please correct me. Okay, so let's take those backwards, starting with the last one. Now I've actually forgotten one of the points. So, actually, let's take it. We'll take the middle, but this is the easiest one. With regards to the break between the divine versus the human, I was referring to the Western European philosophical tradition, and also American, and North American, obviously, we're in Canada, and not referring to what was happening in the Islamic world. And that being said, I think it is quite fair to say that in many Muslim societies there is this tension in the society between some people trying to pull the society towards the secular and some people trying to pull it towards the divine revelation. And sometimes you even see in one family, one person is very westernized.
Sorry, but what you mean with divine revelation? The understanding of No,
I don't mean the understanding. I mean the priority that it's given. Because I really wouldn't say, especially nowadays, that secularism as it's practiced in Europe, and I regret I don't know enough about here to really make any value judgments about here, is not simply another understanding of the Bible. It's not an attempt to obey the revelation. It's become, and I don't think this was the ideal when secularism was invented, but it's become a sense where the revelation is put aside. And there are many reasons why. I mean, abuses of the church and of Christianity in general, different churches and so forth. But the point is, it's not just an issue that practicing Christians who are trying to be Christian have decided that the way we are Christian is to be secular. It's instead a focus on the human and the human accomplishment and the human intellect and worldly progress, worldly science and so forth, and less focus on the religious. Now, I'm not saying there is no religion in a secular society, but I'm saying the direction of society is no longer dictated by religion. And in many very secular countries, there are people who will debate, what does secularism mean? Does it mean everyone has, there are people of faith, but it's just not the determination, not the focus of the society? But you're allowed to discuss it, and some people, say, no, we're going to be very sort of extreme in our secularism and basically no faith. Or communism, for example, that's sort of a clear example. So I would really agree that it's an issue of understanding the revelation. I personally think people of faith are marginalized in a lot of Western societies. Again, I can't speak for here. Canada might be a nicer place. America's actually not so bad in this regard too. There's more respect for faith in the public sphere than in much of Europe. But in much of Europe, definitely, one thing that believers in any faith have in common is that belief is not popular anymore. And it's oftentimes made fun of. So this is the trend that the world has gone in. I'm not saying the world, but this is sort of what's become globally dominant. And so with regards to the Muslim world, what is notable about the Muslim world is that Islam is really the only sort of ideological system, philosophical system to oppose this trend of modernity and secularism and focusing on the human, in that many Muslims do prioritize Islam. Now, we may differ in our understandings of what Islam is or says, but there's an idea that we want to be governed by Sharia, or we want to have Islamic families, or we want to have Islamic government, whatever that's supposed to be, and so forth. So the focus is there's still, I think, a lot more focus on Islam as something which actually is the center of the Muslim society, or that it should be involved in the society. So that's what I mean by this break. Now, of course, again, there's a lot of diversity of thought among Muslims, but I think in general, I think this is true. And I think a lot of Muslim societies, and even Muslim individuals, do feel pulled in two directions, which is why we have that conflict between Islam and modernity. As for understandings of Islam, I didn't mean to imply that people don't understand Islam or didn't understand Islam at all. As Muslims, we believe that Islam is the religion which is closest to the human nature, or the fitrah. So religion is actually quite simple, although we make it very complicated. It is intuitive in a sense. We understand what is good, what is bad. We understand the nature of God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It should be in harmony with the human being, and so you don't need to go and study for 20 years to understand about Islam as a Muslim. Nonetheless, it is true that even if you look at fiqh, for example, there's no time in Islamic history, except for the prophetic era, of course, because the Holy Prophet was there, where Muslims have agreed about fiqh. Even if you just look in one school of thought, there's many debates. Now, we sometimes don't talk about these debates because it makes life very complicated. We give a very simplified view. In Shi'i fiqh, for example, just to give an example, most Shi'i people would say you say Salat al-Maghrib sometime after the Sunni Maghrib. But realistically, if you look in the fiqh books, there's an argument, and there are Shi'i scholars who would say, no, you say it at the same time as the Sunni Maghrib. And so the point is, we don't even agree on things like this. So there are differences of opinion in understanding what the revelation says. And the goal of the religious scholar is to try to understand what is the intent of Allah. So for the faqih, that would be understanding the intent of the lawgiver. What is the sharia that we are supposed to follow by using usul al-fiqh or whatever method they use to come up with the answers. But the point is, it's a process of trying to understand. Now with regards to the examples I mentioned of how I feel Islamic thought regarding women has changed, I think what's notable is, personally, I think some of these ideas aren't really very, how should I put this? I think there's some assumptions that come in with some of these ideas, cultural assumptions or whatever, because they're not things that are immediately obvious from the Quran. For example, how women are discussed. You don't immediately jump to these ways of thought. But sometimes there are assumptions that aren't questioned because you just don't have to question them. And nowadays, we as Muslims are having to question a lot of things because we just can't necessarily ignore things. And I do think the most influential Muslim scholars of the past century have been the ones who have been able to respond to the changes in the world. For example, Shahid Bakr Sadr, by engaging dynamically. So instead of just saying we're going to stick with our old way of thinking, and even if it has no relationship to how people are living, we're going to, still by using Islam as the source, but discuss the issues that people are facing in a way which is relevant. And so again, it's not about changing Islam, but it's just about changing the way that we discuss Islam. So it's a different thing. But yeah, even, and again, in the Shi'i tradition, it said when Imam Zaman comes, the religion he'll bring is so different, some people won't recognize it. I mean, there are many things we don't get. We've been misled, but, I'm not misled, but, this is the human condition. We don't have the Holy Prophet in front of us. So we do our best. And again, the goal of a Muslim is to obey Allah. We try to obey the Holy Quran and what we believe is authentic in the Hadith and whatever other sources we use, Aql or Qiyas or whatever we happen to be using. And then, inshallah, Allah accepts the efforts. That's the position Allah has put us in without the Prophet in front of us to tell us. Anyway, regarding, men and women being the same. Men and women are not the same, obviously. There are some differences. But I don't think the difference is as obvious or as straightforward as in this model of thinking. Now, I could indulge in personal opinion, which is not very responsible. With regards to emotions and intellect, I'm of the personal view, now I don't want to offend anyone male, I mean. I think the main difference is I think women are much better at analyzing and verbalizing emotions and sort of dealing with them critically. And some men are quite good at that too, but I think women for some reason are, that's something that works differently in the female brain, where we sort of can consider and rationalize about emotions with a lot of comfort, and that's something women like to do. But with regards to just the general division, I don't think that's really applicable. In any case, it's been shown nowadays, just through life, that it isn't. With regards to social rights, as I mentioned, generally speaking, I do find the Holy Quran, it is literally a very similar, like وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالْمُنَافِقُونَ وَالْمُنَافِقَاتِ, etc., and how it discusses men and women. And even if you look at some examples, for example, the Bay'atun Nisa, or the oath that women were asked to take to the Holy Prophet, it is the same as the oath that the men took, except the men also had to promise to do jihad, because that's what men do. They defend the Muslim community against the people who want to harm them.
These days you can do that also.
We can. I mean, my understanding of the Islamic teachings is it is better for women not to be on the front lines. Of course, there are examples of female companions during the time of the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, who did fight in the wars. But in general, I think it's agreed that it's better that women aren't on the front lines of war because women are a bit more vulnerable. Of course, we can. We've shown we are capable of killing and so forth. But and there are cases when it's necessary. I mean, if you're attacked or something, or South Lebanon, for example, a lot of women do have to participate in the resistance. But ideally, it's better, I think, for men to do that. But that's only one example. The other things in the verse are the same. Now, I did say there is an exception, and the exception is when it comes to some of these aspects of family law, primarily, like in the verse we were discussing, the famous verse, and also in some of the controversial verses that you mentioned, some legalistic aspects, there are some differences. My point is that these are specific circumstances which largely they do relate to, I guess you could say they do relate to a biological difference. So for example, if the woman is carrying a child at the time of divorce, she can't remarry when she's pregnant, for example. She has to bear the child to term. And that's a difference, and it relates to family law. So there are differences in the family law, which again probably do relate to this sort of very obvious physical difference between men and women. But I would say in general on a human and even a social level that there isn't anything in the Quran which speaks about society and says men and women have different social rights with regards to, we think of just being social, like education or employment or these things. It doesn't say anything about that at all, actually. I mean, you can look at the hadith to find some discussion of these topics, but just the social responsibilities are given out, like I was mentioning in that verse, the يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَلَى الْمُنكَرِ وَيُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ, I think وَيَؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ. I don't remember the rest of the verse, but the point is these sort of main ideas are put on men and women, that they have a social responsibility to carry out these aspects of the divine message in whatever way they do. And of course, I'm not offering a guide for life here. For some women, fulfilling these responsibilities will be within the home sphere, and that's a big responsibility. And for some women, it will be in the public sphere. And that's everyone's individual life to work out how they obey Allah and carry out these responsibilities. Anyway, I hope some of that was useful, but thank you for your thoughts. That was probably quite a long time.
Yes, so we have sister here, and then we're going to take some of the written questions, and then we're going to have. Please.
My question was actually along the same trend, because I wanted to know that in countries where you have a Muslim majority, the population is Muslim majority, the secular democracy that we know in the Western world cannot work then, because they're against qadar here, and like you said yourself, Islam clashes with these modern secular values. So therefore, in countries where you have Muslim majorities, it means secular democracy cannot be a model. Islamic democracy has to be a model, and we know right now that in a lot of Islamic countries, even though some of them have embraced Islam to put them in their constitutional laws, let's say some Islamic laws, some of them don't have the democracy, because obviously the ruler is either a dictator or a despot. So therefore we must be going towards a different system of Islamic democracy, one which is going to apply the rules of the Sharia as the Quran has laid down, not as one person sees fit to interpret it, if you know what I'm trying to say. So rather than have one ruler, there should be a ruling body that is transparent if we want the Islamic model to work. And we should have a judicial system that will correct any,
Yeah, I think the question of the ideal political system in majority Muslim countries, or even semi-majority, which is even more complicated, if say half the country is Muslim or something, and that's a very complex issue, and the question of Islam and democracy is also complex. There are, of course, Muslim countries which are very secular, but as I think you were alluding to, most of them have been complete disasters and have had a lot of repression. So you go in Turkey, for example, Ataturk, he was repressive to the Sufis, there was forced secularization on the people, or the Shah of Iran, again, forced secularization and, killing basically people who were not sort of into that mode of doing things. You look at Iraq and Syria and the Ba'ath Party, I don't even need to say what happened there. So secularism it hasn't had a good track record in the Muslim world. Now, whether you say that's because, whether there's a problem with secularism, or whether it's because some of these people were financed by big foreign powers to be tyrannical and dictatorial, whatever. But it hasn't really worked, and the masses don't seem to have embraced it, and that's what everyone's commenting on now, that if you go back 50 years ago, many people in the West were saying it's the end of Islam and Islam is going to be less dominant. And there was sort of a period of sort of less prevalence of a lot of things that are characteristically Islamic, but nowadays it's changed a lot, and there's a return to Islamic things in many countries, and it's not necessarily working well everywhere. Just to be fully honest, in Egypt, many people have complaints about what's been happening politically. But that doesn't mean that secularism is the answer. It just means we have a lot of problems and instability, and the instability of the Muslim world is not due to Islam, it's due to what's happened in the past couple centuries politically, and having other people just chopping up countries and saying this is the boundary of Palestine and it's Jordan, and here's Iraq, and here's this country, and even half your family's on the other side of the border. Congratulations, you're different ethnicities or nationalities now. So there's a lot of reasons for the problems. Yeah, I mean, there is, in my opinion, I mean, there are so many views about Islam and politics that it's hard to know what to get into. I do think there are a couple fundamental challenges or problems with Islam and democracy. I'm allowed to talk about that. One of them being that, and I think it's a real question, and I'll just leave it like the gender issues, there's questions. That is the sort of theory behind a democracy is the majority decides how their country will be ruled. And maybe they don't decide everything, but it's the will of the people. But the Islamic view is that there are certain things set out by the revelation. So for example, hudud is a very simple thing. There are certain punishments. Now I don't like to use that example because a lot of times that's like the first issue that comes up. But the point is there are some things that are mentioned. So what if the majority of Muslims decides they don't like that anymore? What do? Do you have the majority rules or do you go by the revelation? That's a real issue Muslims face. The other issue, or was that the only issue? Well, that's a big issue that I think needs to be sorted out. But in any case, yes, I agree. We need a lot of. It's a big issue, Islam and politics, and I agree with a lot of what you were saying, especially
it's just because the Pakistan model or the Saudi Arabian model is not the best model for us to.
Not too far off the mark. I mean, of course, you can't really divorce the issue from foreign intervention. I mean, Saudi is very much supported by America, and you know, of course, the type of ruling system they have in Saudi would never work in America. No one would accept it, but it's. You know, there's sort of, because of the oil revenue and relationship and whatever, being an oil source, there's support for the sort of, you know, lack of freedoms, which is, it's a pity. And of course, I'm just going to point out that is, you know, regardless of what you think about Islamic political thought, it is against Islamic political thought to have Muslim countries controlled. And that goes for any country. I mean, even if you're not a Muslim, most people agree that self-definition and you know, not allowing other people to run your country or have a say in the direction of your country is sort of a basic principle. So I don't know why, you know, even when the Holy Quran basically says, don't let other people run your lives politically and so forth, as Muslims we don't seem to get this basic principle. I'm not saying you, but I'm saying you look at some of the Muslim countries and, you know, the Iran-Iraq war, for example, and you find America putting both sides against each other. You look what happens. So anyway, yeah?
Sorry,
my bad.
Just to follow the order of the questions, please answer. I can wait to make you want.
Just a small phrase.
Please, we're going to go with the order. You have to follow the order.
Okay, and I have to follow Brother Ahmed. So surprise number one. Yeah, it's a good question. How can we make sure that when reinterpreting Islamic rules and concepts, we are not influenced by secularism and modernity? Okay, I'm going to divide it into layers, as we often do in the Muslim world. There's the layer, I'm going to divide between the layer of the lay people and the layer of the ulama. Maybe that's not a good break, actually. I hope that when people become alims, that one has a strong enough familiarity with the Islamic sources that they would discuss them authentically. That is to say, they would not be just bringing in preconceived notions and trying to fit the Islamic sources to those notions. Now, does that happen? Of course it happens. It's called tafsir bil-ra'i. I mean, people did that in the olden days too. So it's not something new, but, you know, but I think this happens a lot. Well, for example, we see among Muslims in particular, a lot of the younger generation who they might grow up with a sort of not necessarily a strong grounding in Islamic thought or the main beliefs of Islam. And they learn really their worldview from the society around them. So they might learn that certain behaviors are good, certain ideals are good, even though these are things that are not supported in Islamic teachings at all. So this is the idea they have. And then when it comes to Islam and they see some things are different, then they try to mold Islam to fit the ideas that they already have, because it's a belief system they've acquired. It's just not a belief system that's sourced from Islamic thought. So it does happen. And I think, I mean, honestly, I do think this has happened in every era. I mean, I don't think as human beings we can't be influenced by our background. But it's something that is advised against, at least in the Islamic teachings, and one should try not to be biased. For example, when engaging tafsir. When it comes to fiqh, for example, there is a procedure that has been outlined. Of course, there is the question that's been brought up nowadays whether this is the best procedure for dealing with fiqh, or should one engage in new ways of dealing with fiqh, again with the goal of trying to determine what is the will of the lawmaker of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And maybe just trying to be self-vigilant and self-correcting. I think, like I said, we can't avoid being influenced by the world we are around. But that doesn't change the fact that we do nonetheless need to think dynamically about religion and about Islam and about all of these issues. But yes, I think it does happen many times that people get a certain idea and then they try to fit the religion to that idea. Anyway, the old school, to summarize, the old school method of dealing with it in Islamic thought is you have a debate about it and you bring your evidence and you try to sort out who's closer to the intent of Allah in the scriptures. And you pray for guidance. What can I say? Okay, next question. Can you go over the verse of beating women? Okay, and the definition of the word "adribuhuma." That was a funny thing I just read out loud. Caught that. Okay, thank you, sister. You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to skip. Okay, well, I think probably everyone's getting a bit tired, so should I skip directly to the beating part? Okay, so beating. Does the verse say that men should beat their wives? Okay, so this verse is talking about, the classical interpretation of this verse is for women who are dealing with nushuz, which is generally interpreted to mean a lady who will not fulfill her husband's marital right. I think you can figure out what I'm saying euphemistically by marital right. So she's non-compliant in that department, and what should the husband do? This is anyway the classical interpretation. There are two, and then the verse says...
How reluctant is another important component.
Yeah, but I wanted to get to the beating part because that's what they asked about. Which one has the verse on it?
The black one.
They're all black. Okay, well, okay. Yeah, this is not actually the right one. Okay, thank you for the reminder. Yes, getting warm in here, so my brain is not thinking. Okay, so if you are fearing these women will be non-compliant in that regard, then advise them and then leave them aside in this where they sleep. So go sleep on the couch or whatever. And then if that doesn't work, so whatever that means. Sometimes it's translated as hit. Quite frankly, I don't know why these translators get so excited and say beat. I mean, certainly no one would say beat when they read the verse, but they say that. Okay, so what does that mean? There's two views. More than two views. But one view is that it means, if the lady is non-compliant, the wife, then go through this sequence of steps. So speak with her, advise her, then try sleeping somewhere else, and as a last resort, some people say that means hit. Now, one interpretation is given is that this was a sort of means of basically very politely trying to stop men from hitting their wives, because I would say most of the time when men hit their wives, or women hit their husbands for that matter, it's not something you sit around and think about, like, oh, well, let me have a discussion about this, and then let me sleep somewhere else. So as long as we've been sleeping in another room for a couple of days, and then, it's an instant sort of thing. It's an emotional thing. It's not a rational, let me think this out sort of thing. So it has been said that that was basically to cut down on that practice which was prevalent in the society. And definitely there are a lot of hadith in which the Holy Prophet ﷺ condemned men for hitting their wives and told them not to hit their wives. There's no hadith that says the Holy Prophet ever hit any of his wives or Ahlul Bayt hit their wives. It's not something you find. And so that's one interpretation. And there's many hadith which do criticize that. And it's said that with regards to tafsir, when it says hit, it hits when you hit with a miswak, so you hit with like a toothbrush. it's just symbolic. The other interpretation, which is fairly, actually I don't know how new it is again, as I alluded to it earlier, is that this word doesn't actually mean hit, because yeah, so there's even within the Holy Quran there are many uses of the verb daraba which do not mean hitting.
The context.
Yeah, even in the context of women. But for example, Allah uses it when saying, I'm going to set forth an example or a parable or or this one you're speaking about women putting their clothing on themselves. So it could have another meaning, and one meaning that has been suggested is to go away from them. So the idea is if you're not getting along in the marriage, you speak with your wife and then you go sleep in another place, and if that doesn't work, maybe separate yourself a bit more. And the main justification for that I'm aware of is that this is found in the prophetic seerah. So for example, when his wives would give him a hard time, sometimes he would just go and sleep somewhere else. So you don't find that he beat them, but he just sort of removes himself for a while. So it's sort of tafsir through the prophetic example in that way. Anyway, I mean, God knows. There are so many views on this verse. I mean, to be honest, I don't know. So there are so many views even between scholars. I mean, I have heard some scholars have, like very influential scholars have come to favor that latter view, but the former one is mentioned in hadith to deal with the miswak. In any case, it does not say, the Quran is not telling men they can or should just beat their wives, and certainly not wantonly. I mean, even with regards to the verse, it's with regards to one situation, and not like any other situation, like the things people usually engage in domestic violence over. So yes, men should not hit their wives, and it is said that men who harm their wives, or even women who annoy their husbands, there's gender equality in the hadith, are punished in the grave or in hellfire, so no one wants that, obviously. And people should be good to their families. The Holy Prophet was very kind and very loving to his family, and that's the example that we follow.
The thing is,
sorry, brother. Maybe we can add you to the list.
That was his question, though.
Oh, that was your question?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
if we interpret it as hitting, opening the door for abuse.
I mean, definitely I can see what you're saying, but again, how many people really go through that whole procedure of advising and then sleeping somewhere else, which means at least you have 12 hours to sit there and think about it. And like I said, usually these things, they don't happen like that. People aren't rational about hitting their wives, or sometimes it is in the reverse too. So the idea is that it is supposed to basically stop that practice. It's a bit like the punishment for adultery. I mean, because the punishment for adultery generally requires 4 witnesses. I mean, most people are not so depraved that they're going to commit adultery in front of 4 witnesses. I mean, if they are so depraved, then they should be punished. You know, but the idea is it should make people fear the act, and if they do it, they would fear to tell about it. So it doesn't become okay in society. It's a socially wrong thing. So, you know, if they do it, I mean, Allah's forgiving, maybe He'll forgive them. And there is a punishment if they're caught in there or the 4 witnesses see. But it's an unlikely circumstance. So it sort of, you know, it's a deterrent, so to speak, to cut it down in the society rather than sort of trying to just go and punish people here and there. Anyway, like I said, God knows. I mean, there are these 2 interpretations, and you can argue for or against either one. And you know, like I said, there are a lot of interpretational disagreements about verses in the Holy Quran. That's the nature of it. We try our best to understand. Yeah.
So I guess it's my basically. Just some points. First of all, I really want to thank you for tackling such a complex subject. It involves not only theology, but also fiqh and also socio-politics, as well as, you know, everybody's sensitivities. It's an extremely difficult subject to actually, you know, handle. And I want to thank you for, you know, taking the time to do that with us and helping us, you know, go through these questions. In regards to that verse, I just wanted to share a few points very briefly and then talk about the crux, I think, of this subject, which is the clash or the alleged clash between Islam and modernity. So in terms of the verse, actually, if you think about it, if you really think about it, and the Arabs were actually very aware, especially the Arabs were very good with their language, are actually aware of what exactly this verse is saying. And if you really sit down and think about it, what this verse is actually saying is two things. The first thing that it's saying is, if you hit, then that is not to beat. That's the first thing. And the second thing that it's saying is never do it immediately. Never do it. You know what that means, and that's what she alluded to. So it is haram, in other words, it is haram for a man to hit his wife unless there's a serious sexual problem in the family where actually it's not that she's not giving him his right, but she's also being a little bit not being loyal to him with regards to other men, because there's the other part which is وَحَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ. So there's a real serious problem that is hitting at the marriage. So it is haram for you to consider to darab your wife, whatever that means, unless you have previously you fall in that category and you have previously tried to speak to the person and then think about it, which takes at least 24 hours, and then after that to actually take the time to sleep somewhere else, and that should take more than 24 hours. And then when the marriage is about to break, because the basic foundation of this marriage is pretty much non-functional, notice that the next verse talks about how they will each then move to the next step, which is divorce. And then even then, to keep the marriage, they say get a judge from his family and get a judge from her family. So the marriage is about to fall apart, and you need to communicate the urgent nature of the problem, so then do this dark thing, which again needs to be interpreted properly in the light of what is going on. So the way that this verse should be understood, and the Arabs knew that very well, is that it is haram to beat your wife in the way that most people see it in the absolute sense, because it didn't use the word beat. Beat means something much more violent. Secondly, it is haram to hit or whatever that thing means unless you do these other things. So that's it's a complete different shift. About the issue of Islam and modernity, I realize that especially in today's popular, everywhere, not just on TV and on the news, but even in academic circles, there's kind of this move towards framing the issue as, because it has been a clash in Europe, and this is being projected on us, I think a little bit unfairly. There has been a clash in Europe between what God says and what we say, and there was a very important clash, and they have to, as you mentioned, in terms of the Enlightenment phase, and that was seen as a clash. My question is, why don't we see that as a meeting point instead of a clash? So I'll tell you what I mean by that. So naturally, there's going to be, everybody's trying to answer the issue of this bias. We're trying to address the issue, we're trying to protect ourselves against human bias. There was a human bias in interpreting what God says clearly. The Europeans saw that very clearly in their history, with the church being abusive about what God said. So they wanted to protect themselves from the human bias of what God says, and in doing so, they thought they solved the problem by picking out the church. But the human bias is still there. And they kept that human bias, and they said, well, we will do what we see and empirically measure, assuming the human bias has just, left the door, but there's no proof of that. This human bias is still there. And we assume that as long as we don't start our sentence with God said, anything else we say has no bias, because we said that this is out of whatever we have measured empirically and whatever we think is out of the will to do human rights and so on. And that's false. That's completely false. So if there's a human bias interpreting what God wants by anybody, if there's such a claim, there must be a human bias in interpreting what does it mean to achieve our felicity. And that really brings it down to the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is we want to achieve happiness. We want to pursue our happiness. And there was a theory that would happen if we follow God's rule in Europe. And because of how the European story unraveled itself, that failed. And now there's another theory that if we follow our measured, into the intellect or in their empirical means or whatever, that we are now going to be able to arrive at really our happiness. So I find that this is a meeting point. And the meeting point is that we both want to achieve our happiness. So as a concrete example, if you take the example of this verse that clearly is seemingly putting these two paradigms at a clash. Because here's what God says, supposedly beat your wife, which we explained is not that. And here's what humans say, well, of course you shouldn't do that. You know, the man and the woman are on equal power, nobody should be violent towards the other, and so on and so forth. So there's a clear example of a possible clash. Now, in order for us to get further in this conversation, why don't we consider the following? Instead of just stopping and saying, well, this is what God said, and the other one stopping and saying, well, human rights is the criterion, why don't we go further and discuss that really, let us see how this respects what God says on one hand, and let's discuss that in the next discussion, but also, not to just put what God says in the courtroom, but to also look at why is it that you say that if we do not follow these, we are going to ensure the pursuit of happiness, or we are going to ensure that the human rights are truly respected. Because human rights are based on things we measure. Look, I'm human, you're human. So therefore it must be the same. But you pointed out that there are biological differences and other such things that are empirically different, that we see with our own eyes. So the discussion, instead of kind of everybody pitching a flag on both sides saying God said, and this guy saying, well, democracy or human rights, is okay. Let's look. You are saying that you are ensuring the pursuit of happiness, and let us now practice that. People like Mutahari and people like Shariati, people like Sayyid Muhammad Bakr al-Sadr, were people that actually did that. They went and they started saying, okay, let's start the discussion. I'm not sure 100% because I don't have all knowledge, but let me give you a set of observations to explain to you how these differences in paradigm might be achieving an objective that you have overlooked, Mr. or Mrs. Human Rights or Mr. or Mrs. Democracy, and similarly that you may have overlooked Mr. I'm following what God said, and Mr. I just follow revelation. So there seems to be a meeting point, an opportunity for a meeting point instead of a clash.
Well, thank you for the observations, and I think that is a nice way to tie up the program by bringing these together in one verse.
So we have just to add, you're entitled to this room until 8 p.m., which is now.
Yeah.
Yes, you apologize. We have other people who wanted to ask questions, but I guess it's more important to follow the rules. There is just an announcement to make. There's going to be a ladies' session, sister session with Sister Amina Sunday afternoon in Konkuordia Community Center from 5 to 7. I'm going to put the information on the board. For sisters only, meeting with Ms. Inloes. May I ask you to make some supplications for us to conclude the session, if you think.
Okay. Well, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us knowledge and to grant us knowledge of Him, and inshallah it's a little awkward because I know some of us might be of different faiths, but just from a Muslim perspective, we would ask God to forgive us our sins and to forgive all of those who have passed on after us, and inshallah to help everyone in the world who is hungry and who is suffering and who is imprisoned, and to lead us all on the best path, and inshallah show us the way of truth.
Thank you very much. Please don't forget to join the survey so you can